Hi there, my name is Catherine Hurth, and I'm a financial educator at MSU Federal Credit Union. Today, I'm here to talk to you about credit. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is ask you a simple question. What comes to mind when I say the word credit? Remember, this is as it relates to money and financial terms. Credit has a lot of different meanings and uses in our daily lives, but as it relates to money, what do you think of? Some of you may have said a credit card, a credit score, or a credit report. If you said one or all or none of these things, that's totally okay. Credit isn't something that you'll deal with in your daily life currently, but as you get older, you may start to hear more about it and become more familiar with it. And it's something that once you're an adult can have a big impact. And so I want to talk about just briefly an overview of credit scores, and credit reports and how they interact with each other. So to get started, we're going to focus on credit cards. So a few facts about credit cards. They can be used to buy items online or in a store. It's a loan from a financial institution, and I will dive deeper into that throughout the presentation. The credit card holder will receive a monthly statement that details what they owe every month. And it looks an awful lot like a debit card. So if you were to hold a debit card and a credit card in your hand, you might not be able to tell the difference just by looking at them. So that's where we're going to start, is we're going to dissect the differences between debit cards and credit cards and try and really understand how they differ. So we're going to start with debit cards. A debit card, much like a credit card, can be used to make purchases online or at the store. The biggest difference between a debit card and a credit card, however, is that a debit card is linked directly to a checking account. So my debit card that I have in my wallet right now, if I were to go to Meijer and buy groceries, say I spend $20 worth of groceries, that $20 comes directly out of my own checking account at the credit union. So if I were to log onto my app on my phone and check my balance, I would see that money come out of my checking account. Now, where it can get a little confusing is that you can run a debit card two different ways. The two different ways that you can run a debit card are as debit or as credit. And I think you can understand this is where it can get a little confusing. But what you need to remember is that no matter what, when you run your debit card, it always comes out of your own money in a checking account. So it's always linked to your checking account. We're going to dissect credit versus debit. So when you run your debit card as debit, you input a 4-digit PIN, which stands for Personal Identification Number. That's like your password for accessing your money. And the keyword is personal because you don't want to share it with anyone. Like any other password you might have, you want to make sure it's kept private, because if someone gets access to that, they could, take some of your money or access your account, and it's hard to recover that. So keep that private. When you use your PIN to buy anything, when you're using your debit card, you'll see the money reflected out of your checking account immediately. So if I were to log into my app, I would see that money come out right away. A credit transaction, if I run my debit card as credit, I won't use my PIN. I'll usually sign for it or maybe put in my zip code to authorize it. It still comes out of my checking account at the credit union, but it might take between 1 and 3 days for me to see the money come out of the account. So the reason for that is how it's processed. It goes to a bigger credit card company, which adds fraud protection. And so it just can take a few more days. But no matter what, if I'm using that physical debit card, it's always going to come from my checking account. You have a few other options when using a debit card. So you can deposit or withdraw money from an ATM. Maybe if you're at a convenience store or gas station and you need money quick, like cash money quick, you could put in your debit card and your 4-digit PIN to pull cash out. You can also make purchases, how I said, online or in the store, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And you can also do like cash back options. So if I go to the grocery store and I need an extra, it's kind of similar to an ATM. If I need an extra $20, I can input my PIN and add $20 to that bill. It'll give me that $20 cash. So next up, we're going to dive into credit cards. Like I said, they look very much like a debit card. You've probably seen one before, but it's not linked to your checking account. The money comes from when I swipe my credit card to make a purchase. It's actually a loan. It's borrowed money from a credit union or a bank. And every time I swipe my card, say I go to Meijer and buy $20 worth of groceries, that $20 is added to a bill, and everything throughout the month is added to that bill that I use my credit card for, and then I receive that at the end of the month to make one large payment from my checking account or a savings account or whatever that might be. So this card can be used for purchases, also balance transfers and cash advances, which are a little more complex and we won't get too much into right now. But you can use them for purchases like you would a debit card when you go to the grocery store, gas station, or whatever that might be. They'll usually take, because they process similar to how credit transaction purchases on the debit card, how we just talked about, they go to the big credit card company, so it can take between 1 and 3 business days. And then there may be additional fees added to credit cards because there are other services you can do and things like that. So a credit card, the important thing to remember here is that it's not your own money to begin with. It's borrowed money from a financial institution that you then pay back when you get that bill. So when you get your bill at the end of the month, there are a few things that you might want to pay attention to. So the total amount that you use to buy with your credit card, you'll see that total number there, we'll say it equaled $200. You can pay off the full $200 at the end of every month. And if you do that, you're not charged anything additional. There's no extra interest added or anything like that, as long as you make that full statement balance by the due date. You can also pay what's called a minimum payment. So say my full bill was $200. I might only be required by the credit union or the bank to pay a portion of that. So the minimum payment might be only $20. So if I didn't have the money in my checking account or wasn't able to make the full payment, I could make anywhere from the $20 payment all the way up to $200. But what's important to remember here is that whatever is not paid off may earn additional interest. So you might end up paying more for that amount that you didn't pay off. And we're going to dive into interest rates here on the next slide. So an interest rate is the rental fee for borrowing money from a bank or a credit union. Kind of how I just talked about, a credit card is technically loaned money from a bank or a credit union. So when you borrow that money, they're not able to use it for a period of time. So you might be charged a fee, and that's the interest rate. It aims to offset the risk of lending money. So if you think, when they let me use my credit card to buy groceries or whatever I might need, there is a little bit of a risk that I might not pay it back. Hopefully I will, but there is a little bit of a risk that I might not pay it back, and so interest kind of offsets that risk. Interest can be associated with things like credit cards, home loans, car loans, and more. Really anytime you're borrowing money, there's usually going to be an interest rate associated with it. A higher credit score usually equals a lower interest rate. And we're going to dive into credit scores a little bit later in this presentation, so I hope that makes more sense. But a higher credit score equals a lower interest rate, and subsequently a lower credit score may equal a higher interest rate. So important things to remember here is that the interest rate is the rental fee for borrowing money. So if you don't pay off your full statement balance on that credit card every month, you might be charged a small percentage of whatever you owe. So you might end up paying more. So what is a credit score? I alluded to this on the last slide. So a credit score can range from 300 to 850. And it's a number that helps lenders and others predict how likely you are to uphold your commitments. So I talked about this a little bit, that anytime you borrow money, there's risk associated with it, right? If I were to go to my best friend and ask to borrow $20 and say I'll pay her back next month, if I don't pay her back next month, she's just out that money. So that's a risk to her. Hopefully I'm able to uphold my commitments and pay her back that $20 next month. But if I don't, she might just be out. Ultimately, she might just be out that $20. So when you're talking about borrowing a lot of money, like when you're buying a car or a house, the more money you borrow, the more risk there is involved. And so banks and credit unions want to look at this credit score and get kind of a round picture of just a quick snapshot of how likely you are to repay money. The people who are better at paying money back might have a higher credit score, and people that miss a lot of payments and don't pay things back they'll have a lower credit score. So a higher credit score means that you're more likely to pay someone back. So a credit score is used or is calculated using a number of different factors that are found on your credit report. And that's something we'll take a look at here a little more closely here in just a second. But things that might be included are like your payment history. Do I always pay on time? Am I always a month or two late? Have I ever not paid at all? Things like that. There also might be factors, or there are factors such as how much money is borrowed, how much money is currently borrowed out. Pretend that I decided to buy a really, really expensive house and a really, really expensive car. If I can't afford to make those payments and then I turn around and ask somebody else to borrow money, they might look at all that information and see that I can hardly make the payments that I do have now currently. I probably can't take on more payments. So now we're going to tie the last two slides together. So a credit score and an interest rate. So your credit score is used to determine your interest rate when borrowing money. Like I said, the higher your credit score, the more likely you are to pay someone back. So that usually will equate to a lower interest rate because you're less risky. If you have a lot of missed payments and you have a lower credit score, you might have a higher interest rate just because the risk is more present when you're taking out a loan. So a higher credit score is usually translated to a lower interest rate. And that's why it can be really important that you maintain really good credit and you have a good credit score so that when it comes time to borrow money for big purchases, you have a good credit score that will get you a low interest rate, and ultimately you'll pay less money for borrowing from banks and credit unions and things like that. So if you think of your credit score as when you're in school, you think of it as your letter grade. Say you got an A, a B, a C. It's a quick snapshot of how you did in the class. Your credit report, on the other hand, is kind of like the meat and potatoes of it. So it will include all the details of how you did on every specific assignment, every test, and things like that. So on your credit report, you'll find information about every single time you borrowed money and how well you paid on it. So it'll show, we'll pretend that let's say I've bought a car in my past and maybe I have 3 credit cards. It will show an individual line for each of those times I borrowed money. So 1 car and 3 credit cards. And then it'll have information as well for each time I made a payment on time or if I even missed a payment. So it'll include all those details. If you were to go borrow money or ask to borrow money to buy, say, a car or a house now, that bank or credit union would want as much information about my payment history as possible. So they'll look at my credit score and that'll help determine my interest rate, but they'll really look at my credit report to see a little bit more of a story of how well I pay people and if I'm a risk or if I'm a little more reliable. So that helps determine if I'm able to get approved for additional loans. So additional information that's included on your credit report. I talked about the different if I have a car and then 3 credit cards, but additional information would be my full name, my address, my date of birth, my social security number. Those are kind of the things that make up my financial identity and tell them a lot about me. So that would also be included on my credit report. Also included might be like student loans. If I borrowed money to go to higher education, those would all be included on my credit report and how well I paid on those things. We talked about credit cards and then additional loans. So if I bought a car or a house and borrowed money for that, that information would be included on my credit report. Also included are inquiries. So this is any time that someone checks my credit, it would be considered a hard inquiry or a soft inquiry. And that would also be noted at the bottom of my credit report, just how many times I'm having my credit pulled. So it's important that you don't pull it all the time because that might have an impact negatively on your credit report. And then the last kind of category of things that are included are public records. So if I have any court judgments against me or collections, or if I don't pay my taxes, that I may have a tax lien, and that would be included on my credit report. So what doesn't impact my credit report? I'm hoping some of these things make sense and you're not surprised by them, but things that wouldn't be included on your credit report are your race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, or income. Those things are not found on your credit report. And then this is kind of how they calculate exactly what carries more weight when it comes to your credit report. So 35% of how your credit score is calculated is payment history. So the main thing they want to see is that I'm making all my payments on time and I'm sticking to my commitments. 30% of what makes up my credit score is amounts owed. So that means, am I borrowing more than I can afford to pay back? I don't want to be overextending myself and signing up to make a bunch of payments that I can't necessarily afford with my income. My length of credit history. So this is one that a lot of people, it's one that you can't adjust a lot once you get started. So if you have a longer length of credit history, that might be better for your credit score because it shows that you're just a little more experienced. You've been dealing with credit longer. And so a longer length of credit history has a better impact on your credit score. And overall, that makes up about 15% of your credit score. Also, numbers of types of credit. So this is to show that you're kind of diversified with paying back credit cards and auto loans. So we call those revolving lines of credit or installment loans. So those are ways that you can show that you're kind of diversified with handling different types of credit. And then lastly, we have new credit. So if I go out and I open up a bunch of new credit cards all in one day, that would probably have a negative impact on my credit report. But the more time that I leave before I open up a new card, my credit score will kind of start to recover from that. So that goes along with the inquiries, that once you have an inquiry and a new line of credit opened, your credit might take a little hit, but it'll recover slowly once you continue to make payments on time and handle things appropriately. So that makes up about 10% of your overall credit score. So now we're going to take a look at a short video to see how a good credit score and a lower interest rate can have an impact on overall payment and things like that, and how that can really save you some money.